Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome folks that are sort of tuning into this webinar. I think I'll just set a little bit of context before I introduce our panelists. So this is about DPDP, right? It has now it's sort of moved beyond any sort of legal interpretation and conversation to really becoming something that has actually got to be implemented. And with the May 2027 deadline coming, I think it's important now that companies start to demonstrate that they're ready for it. They're doing the right steps to get there. The reality is the stakes are very high. It's 250 crore up to 250 crore penalties. So it's become a conversation that has moved from maybe a business unit to sort of now a boardroom conversation as well. So that's in that context, because boards are responsible for governance and good governance of companies. I think we wanted to have this discussion and talk to a couple of board members and ask them from their perspective how they're seeing this whole play out, and also talk a little bit more about their views on what the responsibility of the board is really, and how does that play into this narrative, and sort of what should they be looking at and be worried about, from the companies that they're on the board of. So, having set this context a little bit, let me just introduce our panelists. We have Bhaskar Sharma here. He's got about 40 years of experience across various leadership positions in marketing and marketing expansion across India, Southeast Asia, and Greater China. He spent 16 years at Red Bull, which some of you may have heard us talking about it, as a director and CEO, where he built the business sales and distribution network and established that whole category in India. And before Red Bull, he spent 21 years with the Best Foods, Unilever, across very senior leadership roles. Currently, he serves as an independent director in the boards of Polycab India, HDP Financial Services, and EBG Federation India. Thank you for joining us, Bhaskar. We also have Rohit Razdan. Rohit brings over 20 years of experience across operating, investing, and consulting. Before co-founding Tenacity, he was a chief business officer at Clear, formerly ClearTax, where he helped scale the business to more than 10x across all the verticals, geographies, and products. He's also invested in ICICI Ventures, Gaja Capital, and has worked with McKinsey & Co. and Abbott Laboratories across strategy, M&A, operations, supply chain. Then he sits on a few boards now, especially some of the new age companies. So thank you for joining us, Rohit, as well. So I think, we'll just get started. I think the question, so to set a little bit more context, I think the boards today, are of course expected to oversee not only the financial performance, but also the risk and resilience and governance integrity and a whole host of parts of the businesses, and the boards have become responsible for it. And I think as they become more digital, and we need to move into this whole AI native space, and data governance starts to become a very important part of this whole conversation, and especially with DPDP coming in. So my question really is, maybe to Bhaskar, we'll start out, is how do you see the role and responsibility of the boards evolving in sort of a digital first operating environment that we are in? And why is sort of DPDP and data governance now becoming such an active level? First of all, is it becoming an active board conversation? And if it is, then why is it becoming sort of very active now? So I would love to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, thanks, Paritosh, for having me here. I'm here as much to speak and put my questions, as much to learn from possibly you, so you being the expert here. What I'm seeing in the boards is that the conversation has started. There are companies and agencies which are running special sessions for boards, right? And at Deloitte's session, RBI wants a cybersecurity mandatory certification for all independent directors. So I think it is definitely coming. And if you see the wordings, it talks about word is neglect. Now, that could be a director who didn't ask the right questions, right? So I don't know whether no board would be expert on this one, but it definitely shifts the the whole responsibility from just delegating to compliance team. Unlike earlier regulations, I think there are very severe penalties. Now, although it's not very clear to me yet how, and because I also see skeptical CEOs who are unsure of what it would be. But then when you see the numbers, it's 250 crores per breach. It's significant. Yeah, and that makes it materially financial risk that sits squarely in the board in a fiduciary territory. I think one other change which I see is that this data protection officer is supposed to be not reporting into CEO, but to board, if I understood it correct, which means the regulators' thought is to bring the responsibility and oversight to the board. So in a number of ways, I think it is moving in that direction where board, like the audit committee, would be supervising, be responsible to ask the right questions. Does that kind of give you the sense of?
Yeah, I think fair. I think like you said, I mean, obviously it has actually become a board. I think part of the board's responsibility as well. I'll throw it to Rohit as well a little bit, because I think you're seeing a different scale of companies as well. And there, I think it's typically, generally played fast and loose, right? I mean, and growth is the name of the game and all of that. So I would love to get your perspective. Are you seeing that in sort of your portfolio companies as well?
Yeah. So I think there are two aspects of it. Firstly, thank you for having it. I think it's a good and interesting discussion. Honestly, not something that I have been thinking about a whole lot, but increasingly I realize I have to, especially because of the smaller segment of companies where I deal with, right? Because the risks there are like multifold, right? Money running out and this, that, and so on and so forth, right? So the broader risk pie chart looks a bit different than maybe what is Bhaskar's, maybe native boardroom kind of a dynamic, right? So I would say, like, at least in India, in theory, it's all, call it, same, right? In theory, the boards that Bhaskar is on and I'm on, right? They have similar obligation, they have similar dynamic. There's no major differentiation, right? But in practice, in general, in India, they take call it bigger kids first kind of an approach, right? So I think in my boards, I think the conversation hasn't fully landed. Okay, they're aware of the conversation. They're keenly looking to see what the big banks do, what the big tech companies do, and so on and so forth. And then it's gonna be percolating them, right? So it's aware, but not, I would say, necessarily awoken fully. Okay, so that's point number one. Point number two is, I think, because of the relatively, call it, risk first nature of startups, okay, they're going to wait and see, at least the smaller ones, they're going to wait and see when do penalties start, when do people start to get, like, slapped around a little bit, okay, before truly waking up, right? So I think it's going to be a little bit of lull, and then everybody's going to rush to the doors, right? It's going to be a little bit of that, and I think if I just correlate, as you kind of mentioned in my intro, before this I used to be at ClearTax, which is now called Clear, leading several business functions, and we used to have counterparts on the other side. What we saw is that it took like a couple of years, 2 or 3 years, right? But then eventually, whether you're a startup or whether you are the largest company, everybody in that regime woke up to GST and realized that they're going to get fined, they're going to get slapped, and so on and so forth. And it becomes harder to raise capital without it, and so on, right? So when the awakening arrives in the startups, it really arrives, right? Because they realize, unlike a big company, they cannot be caught on the wrong footing for too long, and they don't have that cushion, right? So I see that, whenever the big companies wake up, maybe 6 months, 9 months after that, the smaller companies wake up. And once they wake up, it's also a very small and, call it, tight knit. Like, for example, I am on 10 boards. if I wake up, right, even if from one company, I'm going to make sure that the other 9 companies also wake up, right? So because of the highly concentrated nature of startups, right, I think it spreads, the awareness spreads like wildfire.
Yeah, no, I think fair, and that's interesting because I think what we are seeing is a little bit where even some of the larger companies are just waking up, and we have about a year left. So I'm very curious to see when the startups will wake up and sort of that rush will happen to get alignment with what the DPDP is talking about. Now, one of the things that maybe Rohit, this is to you. So boards have always been sort of part of sort of the governance and maybe the larger initiatives that happen, right? So a large implementation that happens, for a company, the board typically is aware of it and is aligned to it, and there's approvals that happen that enable the board to have a sense of it and a view of it. Now with DPDPA sort of starting to get into this mode of implementation and sort of that similar shift, it also obviously introduces some new expectations around sort of accountability for the board and what kind of view they need to have. So the question becomes, if you were to draw a parallel between DPDP and any other transformation that boards are managing and overseeing, is the risk similar? Is it different? And if it is different, how different is it? And maybe some sharing between both. I'll come to you, Bhaskar, as well, where you've seen if this has been overcome by companies and sort of how do they apply those learnings to their DPDPA journey?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So again, Bhaskar will have much richer and wider experience than mine, but I would say that the two things that I have seen in the last 5 or 8 years, given the segment where I operate, is the things that are at intersection of technology, implementation, and compliance, right? One of those was this whole GST, electronic invoicing, and so on and so forth, right? That was a large scale, call it compliance initiative, done in a digital first kind of a fashion, right? And the second one I would say is more a feature of growth, which is the expectations on accounting and finance and so on have increasingly been forcing companies to upgrade their ERPs and CRMs and whatnot, right? Because so that's I mean, ERP systems are not obviously regulated, but people find themselves forced to upgrade the systems to be able to comply with the financial compliance, especially if you're going public and whatnot, right? So I think those are the two places where I have kind of been privy to in multiple times. And to me, DPDP feels honestly closer to the GST, okay, than the ERP implementation, okay? In terms of the, how it will feel like, okay? Because it would require internal systems to be rewired, right? It would require reports to be submitted. Okay, it's an always on kind of a thing. ERP, as you know, like once it is done, it's kind of done. It like a board will wake up about an ERP or some sort of a large system, backbone system for 6 months, 9 months, then it gets done and then it's gone. Okay, whereas I think in the other one, it's a little bit different, right? So that would be kind of, I would say, it reminds me of that. Okay, now the thing which is a little bit different here is the government has come out. And another thing I would just say is just from a mindset perspective, right? Both GST and DPDP feel like really, are we ready for this, right? So I remember when GST first came out, all of us would remember probably, right? It was like, really, you want all of our invoices and vendors and this invoice and then matching against each other? This will never happen in India, right? Then real-time invoicing came and said, this will never happen in India. Government is going to pull back all of these things because, all of this has not happened in damn US and UK, right? How will you do it over here where half the business happens on paper and whatnot, right? And then the damn thing changed, right? And then, it's implemented like 6, 7, 8 years in today. I feel privacy is again one of those things, right? I think as a poor country, we are like, really, are you asking us, like, our whole country works on, everybody passing everything to everybody, right? So are we really ready for privacy? I think there's a little bit of shock in several circles about, will they really implement it? Are they serious? Are they going to fine people to 50 crores, right? So I think there's a little bit of disbelief on, do you even understand what you're asking for? Okay. But I think what I have realized is the government doesn't back off. Okay. It may give you 6 months here, 6 months there, but the intent is very clear. Okay. And sooner or later, just like they did in GST, they're going to pick up a few big folks and they're going to slap them really hard.
Yep.
It's going to make it to the first page of, Economic Times and this, that. And then everybody realizes if XYZ company could not get away with it, who am I? Okay. So I think this is very deliberate. Okay. And I see them following the same regime over there. Right. So that's what I don't know if I answered your question, but
no, I think it's fair. I think, your point about it feeling more like the GST is spot on, because I think the other ERP, obviously projects tend to be, because they maybe have a large investment. Maybe that's when the board gets involved, saying, okay, you're making this investment. What are you going to get out of it? And that's where it stops. Here it is always on. I mean, whenever the breach happens, whenever the consent is not accepted, something's going to happen. So there is no getting away from it in some sense. Bhaskar, from your perspective, sort of the larger implementations, how do you see this?
I see, Rohit makes a very good point about comparing it with GST. Within GST, if I go back to 2017 where it came, and there was this clause for anti-profiteering. And most of the companies felt it's impossible for the government to actually go down and even establish. So there is no mechanism, there is hardly any reality in this anti-profiteering thing. And then came those slaps to some big ones, including the biggest consumer company and so on and so forth. And then everything changed, right? And suddenly everyone started making efforts to have the full trail of how it's. So I agree with Rohit completely that the intent is very, very clear. It is very much fashioned over the European GDS. So if you see how Meta has been penalized and some of the bigger companies, it is clear that it is there and it's coming to India. So I think the reality would dawn, if not hasn't been fully grasped. It will come. It will become a very, very interesting, sticky question on the board, like the RPTs, like some of those things, as NEFRA and SEBI kept on bringing some of those things. Now this latest is your TCWG. So the intent becomes clear, and then how the companies would take it on. Now, one of my companies is into financial services, right? There's a lot of data and it's personal data, but then also they're conflicting. In some cases, so on one side you have right to forget, on the other side you must keep it for 8 years, X number of years. So is there going to be an interpretation issue between two regulators? I do not know that, but I hope as the things go, because that is what happened to the GST anti-profiteering. The first time around, 2017, it was done, implemented, slapped. But the second time around, it was diluted because it was felt that it was a guidance, but not a penalizing clause. So what happens to DPD is to be seen. But the intent is very, very clear. And I think it's from a perspective of personal data privacy and protection. It is something which every responsible company should embrace, regardless of it's becoming a regulator's job or not.
Right. No, I think rightly said. I think once there will be maybe some penalty, maybe even the conversation will change, because I think, like you said, there are multi regulatory bodies that possibly have a conflicting view of how data has to be managed. But that's something that I think will evolve, and from our perspective, we see it as something that will evolve. They've given some outs for companies to manage, because if RBI tells you to keep data for 10 years after you've left, there is no option. DPDP cannot supersede that just because I asked my data to be removed. So I think those those will get clarified over time. Now, Bhaskar, I'll come to you, and then Rohit, you as well. So I think one of the things is, and I think Rohit, you said very, very, very eloquently, like, look, it touches everything, right? This is DPDP is not one of those, hey, it's a sort of independent some tooling that we are doing. It actually cuts across the organization. It touches every part of the your systems, your process, your people. It's literally all of it. But with this, having said that, and of course, DPOs possibly reporting up into the board directly, especially in case of significant fiduciaries. The question becomes then, how do boards approach this governance within the organization, right? Do you see the role of the board itself evolving? And maybe again, we can make it refer to the GST model, but do you see the board's role evolving? And then, how do they get over the challenge of maintaining visibility into what the company is doing? Because I think, if I were to, again, draw back that parallel to the ERP, there it's sort of, hey, there's a budget line item for the budget, and there's a timeline, and that's about it. And hopefully that gets approved, and possibly, maybe once a year you check whether that's being done. So how, the question becomes then, how does the board evolve to manage this? And then what questions should they be asking the leadership with regards to the readiness?
That's again a very good question. And I don't think I have an answer to it yet. But then the way I see it is, given the importance the government and regulator is attaching to it, it will be kind of getting it right the first time, because the cost is going to be quite substantial. The board, like I said, not everyone would be aware, skilled, and expert on this one. But the question of, do we know what data we hold, why we hold, who's responsible, the data mapping. So I think it starts from first thing is there a DPO, an officer who's in charge of that? And generally what I've seen very early days though, the companies are kind of saying, okay, CISO can do this job as well. Now, technically, yes, but then I think I almost see that as a conflict of interest, because judge and jury cannot be the same. Your whole responsibility of giving the protection versus mapping and being ready for any breach anytime 24/7 is very different. The reporting lines are very different. And double hatting in this case would not be the ideal most. So how the companies are going to deal with it in terms of even structure. Now, slowly, gradually, the compliance officers of the company have started directly communicating with the boards during the independent directors meeting. Even in the audit committee, they would have a separate session. The internal auditors would have a separate session with only independent directors. So I think those practices would evolve on the DPDP, where the full assessment first, starting from an organization, a full assessment, the likely breaches, and then a full mapping of what data, who holds for how long and why. Those are the kind of questions that board will start asking. And if there is, the way I see it, if there is too much of a reluctance, and I don't see this happening in the companies that I'm associated with, but more I read and more I attend some of them where I see some of people taking a lot longer to wake up to it, then I think the boards would start asking as a formal question to say management and get this minuted into the replies as to why they're not doing something, right? To have a clarity that board did ask. And I think that would be for both, for the purpose of it's not an executive role when you're an independent director, but you have a role to ask the right question. So I think those questions would come, the formal interactions would come. And once the questions come, things would start getting measured, presented. They may not be perfect in the beginning, but as long as the boards ask, what are the milestones, where are we finishing? So it's less about activities, it's more about what has been done. Where are we? Can we answer in, if not 24, 36, maybe 72 hours? Can we answer? Today, you ask some of those questions, it might take 6 months.
Right.
So, yeah.
Yeah, no, fair. I mean, I think, would love to hear Rohit's point of view, and then I can maybe chime in as well.
Yeah. So the question is still the same, right? Like, what are boards accountable for, and so on and so forth, right? So, Paritosh, I think I'll start with a slightly different perspective, right? See, I think in general, how India is governing itself is changing. Okay. And that is like now from every direction you can feel it, right? Like to do business in India used to mean certain thing in 2010, 2015 era, and in 2025, 2030 era, it will mean very different things, right? And fundamentally, I feel that the government, and again, because we've had the same government, they've had a lot of time to implement their mindset. Okay. And I think they're not going to back off, right? Because the same set of people who are deciding one thing or the other, right? I mean, maybe there's some departmental nuance, but fundamentally the mindset is coming top down. Okay. And I see two broad things happening. One is they are saying that, hey, as a director on the board, you have now a boatload of responsibility. Okay. So we're going to hold you accountable for how the company is running. It is not the good old, meet once a quarter, have chai samosa and get done. Okay. So there's a real change in stance on what is expected from a board member, right? Again, now the implementation may be a bit different for big company, small company. That's a, regulated industry, non-regulated industry. There may be some nuance, but fundamentally what it meant to be on the board in, let's say my universe, which is a small company universe, 10, 15 years earlier to now, it has changed completely, right? And I'm pretty sure Bhaskar's universe, it might also feel a little bit different. Okay. The second thing is, alongside that mindset shift, okay, they have made things so digital that it is very easy to now catch and penalize, okay, any kind of defaults and so on and so forth, right? So because if you need both, right? You need a mindset change and you need an implementation process, because I mean, at the end of the day, this is India, right? I mean, you publish something, nothing will happen, right? And I think they've realized that they will maybe simplify things to a certain extent, clarify things, and then they're going to implement it hard. Okay. So in that environment, okay, I think it becomes very difficult for a board member to ignore things for too long. Okay. And the penalties, if you get at a company level, again, and some of these things will play out, stay with the board members as well. Right. I mean, so it kind of carries from one place to the other. Right. So just imagine, as somebody who runs a fund, if for whatever reason, one of the companies screws up, okay, and that, gets transferred to me, okay, and now for whatever reason, I now, this becomes a complicated enough thing that I can't take it to other companies, right? Now I have to find another board member, okay, over there, right? So it's a big penalty to kind of, or a big thing to be cautious about, right? So I feel that this construct is now here to stay, okay, and companies and board members and so on will have to learn how to live with it. Okay, right. So that would be my mindset change that I think we have taken.
Yeah, and I think that's interesting, because what we have been seeing, and maybe we've over the last year, I would say we've now started having a few more conversations with board members, but primarily it was always the operators, right? The CEO, CIO, CISO, and it felt like it was something in their purview, and they had to manage this risk and figure it out. But I think, as both of you have pointed out, it is actually now moved up in some way to the board as well, and board is just as responsible, because I think the role of the board is changing itself fundamentally, and so for boards to ignore it any longer, or not get actively involved, at least till they're at a safer place in some sense, I think would be a little remiss from the board. I think this leads me to my sort of next question in some sense, which is, of course, these are large implementations, and there's a lot of time and effort spent on it, and I'm sure as board members, when you see it, you see the line items show up in terms of cost of of implementing it gives you a pause and a thought. I would love to know how the boards are now thinking of these investments itself. Is there sort of a question of an ROI that's being asked, or is it sort of kept as, hey, this is compliance? Yeah, whatever you spend, it doesn't matter, and you should be looking at it from a perspective of make sure you have the best solution in place, and you're properly covered. Maybe again, I'll start with Bhaskar then, and then Rohit, you.
So very frankly, I am not seeing that yet. So the companies, at least the exposure that I have and people have interacted with during some of the DPDP meetings, I don't see the question about, oh, this is going to be costly and therefore we'll find a cost-effective way of doing it. It is seen as compliance. Progressively, regulator has been tightening on various things. And on each one, there has been now a trend of how they are penalized, how they have come hard on the companies. So companies also know that it's not a wishful thinking. This will come and this will be real. So I'm not seeing yet the question of ROI. I think a little bit what I'm concerned, have they really assessed what is the cost of doing it, right? Because so far, it's a CISO-driven conversation about protecting the data security, etc. But now we're talking about possibly a data protection board, which will be a digital-first regulator, right? They're not going to be satisfied by looking at some, very motherhood statements or helicopter view of things. They would go down to understanding the logs, the timestamps, so it'll be very granular what they would be looking at. So neither it can be recreated later, nor it can be flipped, right? So companies would see it as a compliance thing. They would put effort, whatever is needed. I don't know whether everyone is fully aware of what does that mean in terms of cost. I personally, for the companies where I'm associated, I do not see that risk that if this is identified, they would shy away from it. But India has a much larger canvas and a lot of companies. To the point of Rohit, the smaller ones would wait for some bigger one to really get slapped. So there maybe it's a ROI question being asked.
Yeah, I think a fair point. I think the thing that we are seeing, and I think that's where there is a little bit of this, sort of seesaw is that, look, everyone understands there is a cost, and there's a cost of compliance, and this is a large transformation for any company. And I think it's a transformation across people, process, technology. I mean, it's all of it. It's not just a technical implementation and you're sort of out of it. It's a mindset shift. There's change management that needs to happen across the board, for everybody in the company to understand that, now privacy has got to be taken as one of your most critical. But, what we are also seeing is there is an ROI sort of conversation that could be had on top of the cost itself, because, a company that's sort of, does a few things right, can actually streamline their process, can streamline some of their data assets, and at the same time also can actually build trust in the ecosystem, which means hopefully translates to more business. So I think that's one angle that's been playing out, and that conversation has been happening. Rohit, your take on some of this?
Yeah. So I think ROI is an interesting question, and as you kind of alluded to, Paritosh, there are two aspects of it, right? And I think it comes down to the sophistication of the companies and years post implementation, right? And I'll again draw parallels to what I saw very, very closely in the GST world, right? The first, call it phase, is like, that whole like 7 stages of grief. It's like that, right? Like, first it is denial, right? Oh, this will never come, and so on and so forth, right? Then eventually things come to, there's no way out, I have to do it, okay? And then what I saw in the 5th or 6th year post GST implementation is that some of the best CFOs, right, in the GST world, right, then they're the counterpart as the CFO. They said, well, if I have to do it, right, look, if I have the right system, look how much granularity is it giving me on my own system, right? Sure, I'm giving granular information to the government, okay, but now what can I build on top of this, right? I didn't want to, right? I thought I had enough information to be operating my business, but now that I have this almost real-time financial system which is ready to report things and this that, what can I do on top? And that's when the true ROI unlock happened, right? So I think the ROI is in the first very basic Maslowian hierarchy thing is, let me go for a cheap system. Okay. I would say the better companies, okay, now better companies could be in the large scale companies like Bhaskar's or small scale companies like ours. Okay. The better companies, I think, understand now instinctively, and good CEOs understand instinctively that by going towards the cheapest solution, okay, it can lead to rework, it can lead to time, effort, and so on and so forth. And that's something that everybody is, I mean, maybe in some companies there is enough money, not time. In some of my companies, there's no time and no money, right? So rework is extremely expensive. And so they're going for the right solution upfront. Okay, at least that seems to be the mindset. The second level, I would say, is this whole, can I get business? How can this also, this thing that I implemented because of compliance, okay, how can this also help my business? Okay. And then the third thing, I think the most elevated thing which has started to happen is, and we started to see it in my old company, is that the companies which do things properly, right, actually have much higher, I would say, return ratios, right? So they are actually giving much higher return in the market because fundamentally they have created a better, more transparent, highly, call it, compliant kind of a company. And that ROI really comes at a shareholder level in the return on capital of the company and in the share price if you're a listed company over there, right? So I think that is the ultimate ROI, okay, that have you built a very high quality company. And can you see the regulations that are coming in, okay, being pushing you to build a high quality company. Okay, you may not do it if nobody wants you to, right? But if somebody is pushing you towards the gym, in a matter of speaking, right, are you then embracing it, right? Is it eventually good for you, right? So I think that's still maybe early on the DPDP side, but it fundamentally allows you to build a good business. And there's so many companies in India, I won't obviously take the names, who don't have a great image because they know that their data is leaking from their system or this, that, and so on and so forth. And I'm sure even to the boards of those companies and whatever, it's not a pleasant thing. So right. I'd say, there's multiple level ROI.
Yeah, no, that's a very interesting perspective as well. That just by doing some things right, you're actually signaling to the market as well and to your shareholders that, look, I'm a company that actually thinks about quality, thinks about the safety of my consumers, and sort of that signal itself lends itself over time. Of course, I'm sure it's not a immediate return, but over time it just becomes the company that you admire and you sort of look forward to doing business with.
And Paritosh, I'll just add there. Again, DPDP is very early. We'll see how it is. But again, my belief is because it's the same set of people that have made other policy things in the past, what they're going to do is they're going to make it very easy for third parties to look up the infractions, the type of infractions, the count of infractions, and so on and so forth. They're going to make it very easy. It will be one API ping away. You can get, just like today for vendors, you can get their GST track record very, very easily. And that leads to then business level, call it, impact. They're going to do the same thing over here. Okay. Right. And then eventually Indian customer will wake up and say, hey, you know what, like this company is much cleaner on how they're treating my data. Okay. Maybe not everybody, maybe the younger, cooler, more privacy aware people, okay, are going to look at some of those things. And they're going to be other people who are going to make it very easy to say within company A versus company B, this company had 10 infractions, this company had 1,000. Okay, who do you want to do business with? Who do you want to do banking with? Who do you want to do e-commerce transactions with? Right. So I think that eventually will play out.
Absolutely. I think we're getting to the end a little bit, so I want it's a two-parter for both of you. Maybe I'll just combine a couple of questions. I think one is, what's your advice to boards that have not started yet or haven't really taken a look at this and said, "Oh yeah, this is something that's coming, and we need to do something about it." Maybe what's their first couple of things they need to do to get started and on this journey. Second, I think we alluded to earlier, but do you think this is something that will only get real traction when there's the first or second penalty that happens? So I think maybe Bhaskar and then Rohit.
So on the second question first, I personally feel it may not, while I said that it might wait for the bigger companies to get a slap before somebody else wakes up. The companies that I'm associated with have a lot of global exposure, right? Both in terms of the investors and one of the companies also doing a lot of business with Europe, US, Australia, all the countries which are way ahead on a number of things. And it's the same thing in the ESG. So while we have signed an EU deal and everyone can celebrate, but when you actually go and try to do that business 3 years down, 4 years down, when the duties do come down, you would find the CBAM hurdle still being there. So it may not be a minimum requirement for you to work in India, but it does become a minimum requirement for you to be ready and ahead of if you want to sort of expand your business, be seen as a good corporate citizen. And DPDP would come in the same kind of realm, according to me, wherein we would have pressures both from the regulator here, but my old company, it's a European company, right? So they have a obligation to the country where it's incorporated. They would ensure those things happen in the companies around the world. We are seeing the same thing on carbon footprinting. We are seeing the same on scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. The companies which are European based are way ahead. And I see that this will happen in DPDP as well because those rules have already come in there. So it may not wait for the first slap. It might happen and should happen much earlier, even as a table stakes for doing business with some of the countries and getting the money from some of the investors, FIAs and all, that might become an important role. Sorry, what was your first part of the question?
The first part of the question was more, if companies haven't started yet, what's the one thing what advice you'd give to the board on how to get this discussion started, and what's the one or two things they would ask to get the companies to move in this?
I think very, very importantly, each one needs to understand, and there are not very many people who can tell that. There are experts who can at least tell what is missing. So kind of an expert doing the audit of what you have and does it look like compliant. Internal audit, even the biggest firms may not be quite ready with this one. So if you just rely on internal auditors to do this, it might be not sufficient. So there might be a relevant reason to look for experts who can come and help. Companies did that for every major regulatory change that happened. Today you have GST is now a done deal, but CSR, ESG, you have companies which are assessing your ESG footprint before you could start, because BRSR, right now you're reporting, at some point it'll become more like, are you getting to those milestones? So that would be the first step in my mind. And once they present that, the board will also have something to very concretely ask the management, how are we doing on these milestones? So if this is there, check. This is not there. When are we going to have it? Can we have? So that to me looks like one way of moving on this journey.
No, fair. I think that's a great Great point. I think, Rohit, thanks for joining back. I think the question was again to you as well. Is it, what's the one advice you would give a board that hasn't started this yet, and sort of like, here's one thing you need to do to start this conversation, and then, the second part of the question is do we need a penalty before people get serious about it?
Yeah, so I think the first thing as a board member is because the CEOs have 40 things going on, okay, and these days you can just ask your Claude what it means for the company, what it means for you, what it means for the CEO, okay, and just pointing the CEO to the right place, or telling them, hey, in your 40 things to do, maybe this is something else to think about. I think it just becomes useful, right? I mean, that's the job of the board, right? To just gently making sure that the right things are brought up. But if you don't know, if you're waiting for the CEO to tell you, or your CTO or DPO may not be there in many orgs, like I think that doesn't fly anymore, right? So I think making self aware, I think, is the first step, at least as per what I see. The second thing, do you wait till people get slapped around and so on and so forth? I think the first, call it 400 to 600 companies of India are going to move before somebody gets slapped, because they know the people who will get slapped will be amongst them, right? They don't know who it is, right? But so I think the first 500, 600, maybe 1,000 companies in India, whether private or public, it doesn't matter. I think they're going to move relatively fast on this, okay? Maybe not at the same pace, everybody, but all start to move, and I think we are already seeing them starting to move, okay? But I think what might happen is, and it's not about just the question of people getting slapped, it's also people will wait for the regime to become live, right? Because there's a difference between, regime becoming live, like whether this is coming at X date, they keep thinking that, hey, maybe it'll get pushed. Okay. So I think that's what the bigger trigger will be, right? So if I have to just think in terms of like a pyramid, so the first 500 to 1,000 companies, I think, are going to act when it seems clear to them this, okay. You can call it 2,000 to 5,000 companies are probably going to act after the regime has gone live, okay. And then the vast majority, 20,000, 30,000, are probably going to wait till something happens, okay. So I see, the pyramid kind of acting.
Yep. No, fair. I think that's a very fair assessment of this. And I think, with this, I want to sort of maybe take a pause, and there's a couple of questions that folks have that maybe I'll just ask both of you and see if you can get a little bit of a pointer on that. I think one of the questions which is interesting is that, how do you, and then maybe this is not a board level question, but how do you, think of maybe educating folks around the organization itself on this whole compliance? And is that something that's driven as a, is driven through education? Is it driven through policies? How do you maybe do that? Would love to get a perspective on that.
If I go on this one,
Sure.
The way I see it is, it will be, once the questions are being asked, when a new regulation has come in, questions will be asked. They will go from, like what Rohit was saying, you ask the CEO may not have an answer, he'll ask somebody else, and it'll percolate down. That is how I see this happening. Boards will start asking, because early conversation about that has already started, that do we have a full assessment? What the vulnerabilities are? Do we have a mapping of the actual flow of where it's being stored, etc.? So those kind of questions, I think, will lead to everyone percolating down, bringing that awareness, and coming up to speed, because they have to provide the answers. So I think that will be the sequencing.
Yeah, fair. I think we've looked at this problem as well, and we realized that it's a challenge across the organization. So education starts across the board first, because you're only as strong as your weakest link, and I think it could be that one individual sitting somewhere that decides that they don't want to follow this or they don't understand it, and they're okay to share your customers' data. I think one of the last questions that I have here, which I'll take because there's a few of them, will be.
I see an interesting question over there. India runs on WhatsApp.
Yeah.
So maybe you could throw some light on this one because.
Right. So I think, see, India may run on WhatsApp, but I think it's at the end of the day, this is a business. I think WhatsApp is just a platform on which data is being shared. So I think in that sense, WhatsApp is not responsible for what someone shares, but companies that do business on WhatsApp, I think there is going to be again, they're in the same ambit as any other company, right? You have to get explicit consent with the ability for me to revoke or change my decision on what information I want to share with you, when I want you to delete that information. So I think that way it's actually quite managed. I don't think there's that much of a challenge, because I think, in fact, the bigger problem is we still do paper-based consent, right? I think if you think about it, if you walk into a bank today, you still will fill out a bunch of paper and give consent that they will call you and, do all kinds of things. I think that is also a problem to be solved, which I think is also getting solved, right? For example, now we can digitize and take and create that consent artifact out of it. And so at the end of the day, it becomes, for a company to show that they have done all the right, they have taken all the right steps in managing the consent. And once that consent is in the ecosystem, then it's treated the same way as any other consent that you would take, and maybe even digitally. So I don't think we see as much of a problem with WhatsApp. It's a medium. I don't think WhatsApp is responsible. So it becomes the responsibility of the business that's sitting on top, the fiduciary that's managing the WhatsApp as a channel.
Actually, Paritosh, on that point, WhatsApp is the one platform which has had, at least in the past, end-to-end encryption, right? So if anything, it is one of the cleaner platforms out there. I mean, if you look at what happens on SMSs in India, or calls or whatever, right? I think that's you don't see as many phishing attacks on WhatsApp or whatever, right? You see coming through, much more phone calls or video calls or whatever, right? Than WhatsApp itself.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that way it is. I think this is one last question. I know I think this really last question, and this is a great question from someone saying, as a board member, how deeply should I get involved in DPDP without stepping into the management's role?
Yeah, I can maybe go towards this. Again, I think we are probably 1 year away from the final implementation, right? So I think this is one of those things where the temperature will keep rising. Okay, I think I'll go back to what I said a few minutes earlier. I think you have to educate yourself on what is the obligation on the CEO, maybe a functional like a DPO, the company, the board, right? So I think the first step is just educating yourself on what this means. I think Bhaskar mentioned, and some of my companies, this conversation has already started, like, hey, who can audit us? Who can tell us, where we stand, right? I think if we can just get there and bring it up as a board member to the CEO, I think that becomes, a very, very important, call it first or second step, right? Rest of the things, and by the way, I'll also say, like, it just so happens, and I think all of us know this, right? Earlier, what used to happen is the data used to sit in all kinds of places, Excel sheets to be scanned or whatever in 100 different places, right? Now, it just so happens that our DPDP regime is coming just as, enterprise AI is coming, right? As enterprise AI is coming, all the data that nobody could find becomes instantly searchable, okay? Because somebody has implemented something, it's instantly searchable, instantly compilable, instantly cleanable, and instantly transportable, right? These days, like, a Gemini model will just take thousands of, call it, handwritten pages or whatever, and make a clear Excel sheet out of it in a matter of seconds. Okay, so I think the risk of DPDP regime is also important, just from a company's broad, call it a hygiene perspective, right? It's not just a regulatory thing. It's also just business level, data that you have, regardless of the regulation, which becomes important.
Yep, absolutely. Bhaskar, last point, and then we can wrap up.
Well, I think it's absolutely, I completely agree. I don't have much to add to that. I see another question. How can the board members influence enough to course correct the DPDP implementation and all? I think there, again, I'll go back to the same sequencing as what Rohit also just mentioned. I think the board will have to educate first themselves, then ask for some kind of an expert coming and doing that assessment for the company. Those questions being asked, whether they're answered or not, they go into a repository of all the progress that as a board has been making. The responsible companies take it quite seriously if the questions are asked to the board. If they don't have an answer, it gets into the ATR, they will have to come back to that. So the board does have a fair amount of reasonable sense of how to sort of push things. Of course, board, especially the independent directors, are not in the executive positions and they shouldn't be starting to step on toes. So right questions, the right tone, right guidance, making them aware in case they're not aware of the outcomes. And for directors themselves, I don't think DNOs would give significant protection against some of these things, right? So for the directors to themselves know what the risk is by this coming into the board, I think their awareness would systematically change their own behavior and questions, and that would make the change, I think so.
Yeah. Well, on that note, thank you so much. This has really been great. I think it's great to get the contrasting views from sort of the large company board perspective and then a bunch of startups, that Rohit, you deal with, because I think they're all at different stages of their journey. And at the end of the day, it sounds like, one of the things which is very clear from this conversation is that the board definitely now has a bigger role to play in, maybe it is in guiding, maybe it's in giving direction, maybe it's just asking the right questions to say, hey, are we doing all the right things in terms, to ensure that the company itself will remain viable and sort of protect itself from any sort of penalty in the future. So thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. Thank you, Bhaskar. Thank you, Rohit. Thank you for taking your time for this conversation.
Thanks for running this session. I think it's a very timely session.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, guys.
Only go on from it.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. Thank you.